In a town called Redemption, a 17-year-old girl was about to discover that sometimes saving a life means destroying your own, and sometimes the monsters aren't the ones you've been taught to fear. Her name was Cora, and in that town, a name was all you really had. The cold didn't just bite that autumn, it had teeth, and it was trying to kill you. For Cora, the cold was more than weather. It was a tenant in her bones, a deep, unshakable chill that no fire ever seemed to touch. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of a town named for a hope it had long since forgotten. Redemption. What a joke. Her life was a loop. Wake before the sun, stoke the fires at the boarding house, haul water until your shoulders felt like they'd been ripped from their sockets, scrub the sins out of other people's sheets in steaming, harsh water, day in, day out. She moved in a bubble of silence, her face a pale mask, her eyes always down, always focused on the next task. The townspeople saw her, but they didn't see her. She was the orphan girl, a piece of furniture, a stray dog they didn't have to feed. She'd arrived years ago, a forgotten piece of luggage from a church group that moved on. Her parents were just blurred faces in her memory, swallowed by fever somewhere on the trail west. For Cora, loneliness wasn't a feeling. It was the air she breathed. It was the sky over her head. At 17, she wore the exhaustion of a woman 4 times her age. Her home was a tiny, slanted room tacked onto the back of the laundry. It smelled of damp rot and soap. The one window looked out on an alley where other strays fought over garbage. At night, the wind howled across the plains, and it sounded like something grieving. A sound she understood perfectly. Survival, she had learned, was about being small, unnoticeable, expecting nothing. That way, you were never disappointed. Her heart was a locked room, and she'd thrown away the key herself. And then the blizzard came. It didn't creep in. It fell on the town like a mountain collapsing. One minute there was a sky, a horizon. The next, just a furious, screaming wall of white that swallowed everything. The world simply vanished. People ran for cover, doors were slammed and barred. In less than an hour, the world outside your own 4 walls just ceased to exist. Cora was caught right at the end of her shift. The laundry owner, a woman with a face like a dried apple, waved her out into the storm. "Hurry on home," she'd said, as if Cora had a warm fire and a family waiting. She had neither. The walk to her little room, usually just a few dozen steps, became a battle for her life. The wind was a physical thing, a giant hand trying to crush the breath from her lungs. Snow wasn't falling, it was flying sideways, stinging her face like 1,000 tiny glass needles. She stumbled along the alley, one hand flat against the rough wood of the general store, her only landmark in the blinding white chaos. She was almost there. Just a few more feet to her door, to her thin mattress and her threadbare quilt. That's when she heard it. It was a sound so small, so thin, the storm almost ate it whole. A cry, not the wind, not an animal. She froze, every instinct screaming at her to ignore it, to keep moving, get inside, lock the door. This world didn't reward heroes. But the sound came again, a weak, mewling sound of absolute distress. It was coming from a snowdrift piled high against a stack of old, busted crates. Her feet, for the first time in her life, refused to obey the sensible part of her brain. That little sound had somehow found the key to her locked-up heart. She pushed through the snow, her skirts instantly heavy with ice and slush. And there, tucked in a hollow between the frozen wood, she saw it. A cradle board. Not the simple kind you'd see in town. This one was intricate, covered in beautiful beadwork, a work of art half buried in the snow, and strapped inside that protective frame was a baby. Its face was raw and red from the cold, its tiny lips tinged with a terrifying shade of blue. Its dark eyes were wide with a terror it was too young to even understand. And Cora knew in an instant that this was the most dangerous thing she had ever seen in her life. Because by the markings on the board, the style of the beading, she knew what this child was. Lakota, an Indian child, abandoned or lost, in the middle of a killer storm, right in the heart of a town that hated its very existence. Her mind raced. The safe thing to do, the smart thing, was to turn around. Right now. Pretend she never saw it. The snow would cover it in minutes. No one would ever know. The world was a harsh place with simple math, and this child was on the wrong side of the equation. But she couldn't move. She looked at that tiny chest, rising and falling in shallow, desperate little puffs. And she didn't see a savage. She didn't see a threat. She saw a life, as small and as lost as her own had once been. She saw her own loneliness reflected in those terrified dark eyes. The wind howled around her, a monstrous, terrible lullaby. And in its scream, Cora heard a command. This wasn't a choice, it was a duty. With fingers already numb and clumsy, she reached down. She unhooked the cradle board from whatever it was snagged on, and she lifted the impossibly heavy burden into her arms. In that moment, Cora turned her back on safety, on sense, on the entire world she knew, and she carried the child into the heart of the storm. Her room was an icebox. The wind found every crack, every seam in the cheap wood, and screamed its way inside. The first thing she did was shove her extra shawl into the gap under the door, a pathetic attempt to keep the world out. The world was gone. Now it was just this tiny, freezing room, the storm, the crying child, and a fear so profound it made her teeth chatter. She fumbled with the straps on the cradle board, her fingers stiff and useless. The baby's clothes were damp. Its skin was so cold it felt like stone. Panic, cold and sharp, stabbed her in the chest. She had nothing. No milk. No food. No idea how to care for something so fragile. The baby's cries were getting weaker, fading into a tiny whimper that twisted something deep in her gut. She had to do something. Now. Acting on pure instinct, she stripped off her own wet shawl and coat, down to her driest chemise. Then, as gently as she could, she stripped the baby of its cold, damp wrappings. Without a second of hesitation, she pressed its tiny, freezing body against her own bare skin. She pulled her one worn quilt over both of them. The shock of the child's coldness made her gasp, a jolt that went right through her. But she held on tighter, wrapping her arms around it, trying to force her own meager warmth into its failing little body. The world shrank. The hours that followed weren't hours. They were a single, long, desperate moment. The blizzard raged outside, a relentless animal trying to claw its way in. Snow piled up against her little window, burying her in a dim, gray twilight. She just lay there, on her straw mattress, the baby on her chest. She listened. The howl of the storm, and the tiny, fragile rhythm of the baby's breathing. When the baby cried with hunger, a raw, painful sound, she did the only thing she could think of. She took a piece of her own stale bread, chewed it until it was a soft, wet paste, and gently pushed it into the corner of the baby's mouth with her little finger. It was a clumsy, desperate act of mothering. It was all she had. Days bled together. 1 day, 2 days, 3. The storm never stopped. It was alive. It was hungry. But the storm outside wasn't the worst enemy. The real enemy was inside the room with them. It was the cold. It was a snake, slithering through the walls. She found the source. A small gap in the window frame where the wood had warped. A tiny, constant stream of Arctic air was pouring through, flowing directly over her makeshift bed. The baby, this little one she was now responsible for, would shiver violently every time that icy draft touched its face. Cora shifted. She tried to block the draft with her shoulder, with her head, with the quilt. But it was like trying to stop a river. The cold always found a way. She looked at the baby's face, so small, so vulnerable. Its breath was a tiny puff of mist in the frigid air. And in her chest, a feeling she had never experienced before rose up like a fire. It was fierce, it was powerful, it was protection. Without thinking, she did something that would change her forever. She cupped her hands over the baby's head, first her right, then her left, forming a small, fleshy shield, a little cave of her own making to deflect that stream of killing air. She created a tiny pocket of stillness around the child's face, and she held it. She held that position for what felt like an eternity. An hour, 2 hours, 5. The sun went down, and the world went from gray to black. And still, she held it. At first, her hands just felt cold. Then, they started to ache, a deep, throbbing pain that spread up her arms like poison. After the ache came the burning, a searing, fiery sensation, as if she were holding her hands directly in a flame. She bit her lip until it bled, refusing to make a sound, refusing to move. Finally, the burning faded, and it was replaced by a deep, terrifying numbness. She couldn't feel her fingers at all. She knew what this meant. She'd seen it on trappers who'd misjudged a winter night. She knew what happened to flesh when it froze solid. But she couldn't move. She wouldn't move. Because for the first time since the storm began, the baby had fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep on her chest. Its breathing was even and steady. And in that moment, that was the only thing in the entire world that mattered. The world had shrunk to the sound of that one tiny heartbeat. In the faint, snow-filtered light, she risked a glance down at her fingers. They were waxy, white, like candles. She tried to wiggle them. Nothing. They didn't belong to her anymore. A small, cold part of her brain registered the facts, catalogued the damage, calculated the future pain, the loss. But the rest of her, the part that was curled around this tiny, trusting life, felt a strange, impossible peace. For the first time, her life was about something more than just her own survival. She had given a part of herself to keep another soul warm. A sacrifice. Not for a god or a flag, but for a nameless baby in a blizzard. And in that act of ruin, something inside Cora that had been frozen solid for years began, impossibly, to thaw. When the storm finally broke on the 4th day, the silence was louder than the wind had ever been. It was a heavy, pressing quiet. A single ray of sunlight, so bright off the new snow it hurt to look at, sliced through a crack in the window. It felt like an invasion. The world was coming back, and with the world came all its dangers. Cora's bread was gone. The baby was weak, but it was alive, nestled against her. Her hands, however, were a nightmare. The numbness was gone. In its place was an agony so immense, so total, it made her vision swim and black out at the edges. The 2 smallest fingers on her right hand were no longer white. They were turning a mottled, hideous shade of blue and black. They were dead. That's when the knock came. It wasn't a polite knock. It was a loud, heavy fist pounding on her door. Boom, boom, boom. Cora's heart didn't just jump. It felt like it stopped completely. She clutched the baby closer, a primal animal instinct. "Cora, open this door! We know you're in there!" It was the voice of Mr. Hale, the owner of the general store, the town's self-appointed guardian of morality, a man whose piety was as thin as his smile. Slowly, painfully, she shuffled to her feet. Her limbs screamed in protest. She fumbled with the wooden bar on the door, her swollen, useless fingers barely able to work the latch. She pulled the door open, and there he was. Hale stood there, his face pinched with righteous fury, and beside him stood the sheriff, a man named Donovan, whose expression was a permanent mask of weary disapproval. Their eyes went from Cora's pale, defiant face, to the bundle in her arms, and then to the beaded cradleboard leaning against the far wall. Hale's face twisted, curdled with a disgust so potent it was almost a physical thing. "Sweet Mother of Mercy," he hissed. "It's true, then. You brought a heathen savage into this town. Cora found her voice, though it came out as a raw whisper. She's a baby. It's an Indian, Sheriff Donovan corrected, his own voice flat and cold as a river stone. Where did you get it? I found her, Cora said, and was surprised to hear a sliver of strength in her own voice. In the storm, she would have died. Maybe that was God's will, Hale snapped, his religion always a weapon, never a comfort. You have no right. That thing is not your concern. It's a danger to us all. The tribe will come looking for it, and when they do, there'll be trouble. Word had already spread. A small crowd was gathering behind them in the alley, their faces a mix of fear and ugly curiosity. They stared at Cora like she was a circus freak. She had done more than break a law. She had broken their most sacred, unwritten rule. She had crossed the line. She had chosen the other side. You'll give the child to me, the sheriff said. His tone wasn't a request. We'll handle it. Handle it? The words were out of her mouth before she could stop them. She knew what that word meant out here. What does that mean? Donovan's gaze was ice. That's not your concern, girl. Now hand it over. He took a step forward. Cora took a step back. She pressed the baby so tightly to her chest that it let out a small, frightened whimper. No. A gasp rippled through the crowd. The orphan girl. The silent, invisible girl who never spoke, who never looked anyone in the eye, had just said no to the sheriff. Hale's face flushed a blotchy, angry red. You defiant little whelp! After this town has sheltered you, fed you, you bring this filth into our midst and you defy the law? The raw anger in his voice was strange. It was more than just prejudice. It was personal. It was venomous. The sudden, white-hot flare of pain in her hand was so blinding that an involuntary cry escaped her lips. She swayed on her feet, the world turning gray. And that's when Sheriff Donovan noticed her hand for the first time. He stopped, his eyes narrowing. What in God's name happened to your fingers? Cora tried to hide her ruined hand, cradling it with her good one. It's nothing. Nothing? Donovan's professional curiosity took over for a second. Girl, that's frostbite. A bad case of it. You'll lose those fingers if they aren't seen to. That's what happens when you consort with savages, Hale muttered, his eyes gleaming with a sick kind of satisfaction. It's the mark of her sin. But the argument was cut short. A new sound rippled through the crowd, a murmur of a different kind. Not curiosity, but alarm. The people at the back of the alley began to shuffle, to move aside, parting like a reluctant sea. Into the space they cleared, 5 figures rode on horseback. And the town fell silent. They were Lakota, and they were all women. They sat on their horses, wrapped in thick buffalo robes, their faces carved from stone, etched with a gravity and a purpose that made the sheriff and his bluster seem childish and small. The only sounds were the creak of saddle leather and the soft snorting of the horses as their breath plumed in the cold air. The lead woman dismounted. She was older, her hair streaked with silver, her face a beautiful, dignified map of sorrow and endurance. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace that commanded the space around her. Her dark eyes swept over the entire scene, taking in the hostile faces of the townspeople, the nervous sheriff, Mr. Hale's hateful glare, and finally, Cora. Her gaze lingered on Cora. It flickered to the tiny, dark-haired baby clutched in her arms. And then, her eyes dropped to Cora's ruined hand, which she was no longer trying to hide. The pain had made her careless. The blackened fingers were in plain view for the world to see. A younger man who had ridden with the women dismounted and stood beside the leader. He spoke to Sheriff Donovan, his English passable, but heavy with an accent. We are looking for a child, the daughter of Swift Deer. She was lost in the great snow. The child is here, Donovan said, gesturing stiffly at Cora. This girl found it, We were just arranging for its return. It was a lie so blatant it was almost funny, but he said it with a perfectly straight face. The lead woman, whose name Cora would learn was Winona, completely ignored him. She continued to look only at Cora. She spoke in her own language, her voice low and melodic, like stones rolling in a riverbed. The young man translated. She asks how the child survived the storm. Cora swallowed, her throat painfully dry. I found her. I took her to my room. I kept her warm. Winona spoke again, her eyes never ever leaving Cora's face. The translator relayed the next question. She asks what happened to your hand. Cora looked down at her own grotesque, discolored fingers. Then she looked back up at this powerful, imposing Lakota woman. And for the first time, she didn't feel shame. She didn't feel fear. Just a strange, sad acceptance. The wind was cold, she said, her voice clear and steady. It came through the wall. I had to keep it off her face. She didn't need to say anything else. The story was written there, on her dead flesh. Winona's stern expression didn't change, but something deep in her eyes shifted. A flicker of understanding, a recognition that went far beyond language. She took a deliberate step closer, her gaze finally softening as she looked at the baby, who was now awake and staring back at her with wide, intelligent eyes. Then she looked back at Cora. At this pale, trembling white girl who stood defiant against her own people. This girl who had willingly maimed herself to protect a child that was not hers, a child of a people she'd been taught to hate. Winona spoke a few quiet words to the other women. One of them, an older woman with eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 years of wisdom, nodded slowly. Winona turned back to the translator. Her next words dropped into the stunned silence of the alley like stones into a frozen pond. "We have come for the child," the translator said, his voice ringing with the woman's authority. "The child is our blood. We will take her." He paused, and Winona took another step, until she was standing directly in front of Cora, so close Cora could feel the warmth coming from her buffalo robe. She reached out a weathered hand, but she didn't reach for the baby. She reached for Cora, gently touching her shoulder. "But we will not leave the one who shielded her." The translator continued, his voice filled with a strange awe. "Your sacrifice has marked you. Your heart is not the heart of these people. You have the heart of a Lakota mother. You have paid in flesh for this child. You are now kin. You will come with us." A wave of collective shock rolled through the onlookers. Mr. Hale's jaw dropped open. Sheriff Donovan looked completely, utterly bewildered. His simple world of black and white, of us and them, had just been shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. He had expected a fight. He had expected a tense, ugly negotiation. He had not, in his wildest dreams, expected this. An adoption. "Now, hold on," Donovan finally managed, finding his voice. "You can't just take her. She's one of us." For the first time, Winona looked directly at the sheriff. Her gaze was filled with a pity so profound, so dismissive, it was more insulting than any threat could ever be. The translator spoke her words, cold and sharp. "She was never one of you. You saw an orphan to be used, a mouth you resented feeding. You did not see her heart. We do. The choice is hers." And just like that, every single eye in that alley turned to Cora. The world had split right down the middle. Behind her was redemption. The town that had given her nothing but scraps and scorn. The people who now saw her as a sinner, a traitor. A place where she would be an outcast forever. Ahead of her were these strangers. These people she had been taught her entire life to fear. And they were offering her the one thing she had never even dared to dream of. A place to belong. She looked down at the baby in her arms, this tiny life for whom she had sacrificed a part of her own body. She looked at her blackened, dead fingers, the permanent, ugly price of that bond, and then she looked up into Winona's steady, waiting eyes. Her decision wasn't made with her mind. It was made with a part of her soul that had just woken up in the heart of the blizzard. With a deep, shuddering breath, she took a single shaky step forward, away from the sheriff, away from Mr. Hale, toward Winona. It was all the answer anyone needed. One of the other women dismounted and gently, reverently, took the baby from Cora's arms, murmuring soft, comforting words to it in their language. Winona put a firm, supportive arm around Cora's waist, taking her weight as she swayed, utterly exhausted and overwhelmed by the agony in her hand. "You are safe now, daughter," Winona said in her own tongue. Cora didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. It was the sound of coming home. But as they started to turn, Cora remembered something, a detail that had been buried under the pain and the fear. "Wait," she said, her voice still weak. She looked at Winona, then at the translator. There was something else, in the cradleboard. The translator relayed her words, and Winona's eyes narrowed with a new intensity. "When I brought her inside," Cora explained, her mind racing to get the details right, "I checked the wrappings to see if anything was dry. Tucked deep inside the furs, there was this." She reached into the pocket of her worn dress with her good hand and pulled out a small object. It was a bird, carved from a piece of pale, smooth wood, with a single tiny turquoise chip for an eye. It wasn't Lakota work. The style was different, simpler. She held it out. Winona took it, her expression unreadable. She turned it over and over in her palm. The other women gathered closer, murmuring in low, urgent tones. The air in the alley, already thick with tension, suddenly became electric. Winona looked up, and her eyes weren't just sad anymore. They were like burning coals. She spoke a single, sharp word to the translator. His face went pale. "She asks where, exactly, you found the child," he said, his voice tight. "By the crates," Cora said, pointing a trembling finger. "Behind the general store." Mr. Hale, who had been watching this with sputtering rage, suddenly went very, very still. The color drained from his face. Winona locked her eyes on Hale. She held up the small, carved bird, and she spoke, her voice not loud but carrying a terrible weight that cut through the cold air. The translator's voice followed, a grim echo. "This carving belongs to a white trader, a man who called himself our friend, a man who traded with us for years. His name is Ames." A few of the older townspeople shifted uncomfortably. They remembered a man named Ames, a friendly, smiling trader who had passed through years ago, a man who had vanished without a trace. "He was the father of Swift Deer's child," the translator continued, the story unfolding with chilling precision. "He promised to marry her, to join our people, but he was a man with two faces. On the day of the great snow, he did not come for her. He came with two other men. They attacked her camp. They were looking for something he claimed she had stolen from him. They killed her. They left her in the snow. They took the child. But they did not know she had a sister who watched from the trees, hidden. A sister who saw everything." Every person in the alley turned to stare at Mr. Hale. His face was a mask of waxy, sweaty terror. He looked like a cornered rat. "That's a lie," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "A savage's lie." "Ames the traitor," Winona said, taking a deliberate step toward him, the translator matching her pace. "He was a man who suddenly came into a great deal of money, enough money to buy a general store, enough money to change his name, enough money to pretend he was a respectable man, a man like Mr. Hale." Sheriff Donovan looked from the terrified store owner to the resolute Lakota woman. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture uglier than anything he could have imagined. This wasn't about a lost child. This was about a murder. "You have no proof," Hale stammered, backing away. It's my word against hers. We have a witness. Winona's voice was like ice. And we have this. She held up the bird carving. The child's mother put this in the cradle board. She knew he would come for the baby. She left this so we would know who did it. She left it so we could find her daughter. Hale's eyes darted around, looking for an escape, for an ally. He found none. The townspeople were backing away from him, their faces masks of horror and fascination. They were seeing the man they thought they knew disappear, replaced by a monster. "Sheriff!" Hale pleaded. "You can't let them do this. You're the law." Sheriff Donovan slowly drew his pistol, but he didn't point it at the Lakota women. He pointed it squarely at Mr. Hale. "Ames," Donovan said, the name tasting like poison in his mouth. "I remember you now. You worked for the freight company, left right after that payroll wagon was robbed and the guards were killed. The same year you bought this store." Hale's face collapsed. The final lie had been stripped away. He was exposed. In a single, desperate motion, he lunged, not at the sheriff, but at Cora. He grabbed her, pulling her in front of him as a shield, a rusty knife appearing in his hand, its tip pressed against her throat. "Stay back!" he screamed, his voice a raw shriek of panic. "All of you, stay back or I'll kill her." But he had made a fatal mistake. He had threatened the one person in that alley who was now under the fierce, absolute protection of the Lakota. He had threatened their kin. Before Sheriff Donovan could even shout a warning, something moved with impossible speed. It was Winona. In her hand was not a weapon, but a heavy leather pouch filled with sand or stones used for training horses. She swung it in a short, brutal arc. It connected with the side of Hale's head with a sickening thud. His eyes rolled back in his head, the knife clattered to the frozen ground, and he crumpled into a heap at Cora's feet, unconscious. Justice, swift, clean, and absolute. The journey to the Lakota winter camp was a blur, a haze of pain, exhaustion, and a strange, floating sense of unreality. Cora rode a horse led by Istas, the wise-eyed older woman. She was wrapped in a thick, warm buffalo robe that smelled of wood smoke and sage, a scent she would come to associate with safety. The town of Redemption, with its narrow streets and even narrower mines, vanished behind them, swallowed by the vast, silent plains of snow. The pain in her hand was a living thing, a constant, searing fire that consumed her thoughts. But every time a sob threatened to break free, Winona would ride close, her presence a silent, steadying comfort. Their arrival at the camp was nothing like she'd imagined. It wasn't loud or savage. It was quiet and solemn. A collection of teepees nestled in a river valley, sheltered from the relentless wind. Smoke curled from their peaks, a welcome sign of life and warmth. Cora was taken immediately to a separate lodge, the air inside warm and thick with the scent of unfamiliar herbs. This was the healing lodge, and her trial was just beginning. The tribe's medicine man was a quiet elder named Kuruk. He examined her hand with fingers that were impossibly gentle, his eyes holding a deep, ancient sadness. There was no gentle talk, no false hope. The 2 fingers were dead. The poison was spreading. They had to come off. Now. The procedure was swift. It was brutal. It was done with a sharpened obsidian knife and a searing hot brand to close the wounds. Cora screamed until her throat was raw, her body held down by the firm, compassionate hands of Winona and Istas. They never left her side. Through the haze of pain, she felt them bathing her forehead, forcing sips of a bitter, pain-dulling tea between her lips, murmuring to her in their soft, flowing language. The weeks that followed were a slow, painful climb back to life. They cared for her with a tenderness she had never known. They brought her broth, spooning it into her mouth when she was too weak to move. They changed the herbal poultices on her hand, their touch always careful, always gentle. They spoke to her constantly, not asking for answers, just filling the silence with the sound of their world, weaving her into the fabric of their lives, one word at a time. The baby was her most frequent visitor. She learned his name was Chaitin, which meant falcon. His mother, Swift Deer, had been Winona's own niece. The women of the tribal council were now his mothers, and by their decree, so was Cora. They would bring him to her, laying him on the furs beside her. He would watch her with his dark, intelligent eyes, sometimes reaching out with a tiny, perfect hand to touch her bandaged one. As her body healed, something much deeper began to mend. The gnawing loneliness, the constant gray weather of her soul began to recede. It was replaced by something new: connection. She was no longer Cora the orphan, the ghost girl. Here she had names: Anawanji, one mother, or Nape Sa, the one with the red hand. The names weren't insults. They were titles of respect. They told the story of her sacrifice. Learning their way of life was hard. The language was a beautiful, complex river of sound she struggled to navigate. The work was constant: scraping hides, gathering wood, grinding corn, but it was always shared. No one labored alone. The air was filled with the laughter of children, the murmur of elders telling stories by the fire. This was community, breath and blood and spirit, and they had made a place for her. Months passed, the snow melted, and the world turned a tender, hopeful green. Cora's hand healed into a scar, a permanent, puckered reminder of her journey. The two missing fingers were a phantom limb, an ache of memory. But when she looked at her own altered hand, she no longer felt horror. It was a part of her story. It was the proof of the choice that had not only saved Chaitin's life, but had saved her own. She learned to cook, to sew, to work with 1.5 hands, her movements becoming sure and fluid. She was no longer clumsy. She was capable. One bright afternoon in the late summer, she sat outside the teepee she now shared with Istas. The sun was warm on her face. A short distance away, Chaitin, now a sturdy, determined toddler, was taking his first wobbly steps. He stumbled, falling onto the soft grass with a comical look of surprise, but he didn't cry. He just pushed himself back up, his little face a mask of fierce concentration, and took another step, then another. His arms outstretched for balance, his eyes locked on her. Winona came and sat beside Cora, their comfortable silence a language all its own. They watched the boy together as he made his triumphant journey across the grass. He finally reached her, tumbling into her lap with a happy, gurgling laugh. She wrapped her arms around him, her scarred hand resting gently on his back. The feeling of his small, warm body against hers filled up all the last empty spaces inside her. "He has your spirit," Winona said softly in Lakota. Cora understood her perfectly now. "He does not give up." Cora looked down at the child in her lap, then at her own hand, the visible proof of her transformation. She had lost a part of herself in that blizzard, but she had gained an entire universe. She had learned that home isn't a building or a town. It's the shelter two souls can build for each other. Here, among a people she was taught to fear, she had found her family. Here, in the shadow of her own sacrifice, in a place far from that hollow town, she had finally, truly, found redemption. The wind that blew across the plains no longer sounded like something grieving. It sounded like a song. If you believe one act of courage can change the world, hit that subscribe button and join us for more stories that remind us what it truly means to be human.